Hello and welcome to Tektite 2020, Women of Sea and Space. It is my pleasure to welcome you all today to this historic occasion where we celebrate since the Tektite II Mission 6 crew lived and worked underwater, the first all-female Aquanaut crew to do so. I'm speaking to you from another down under in Melbourne, Australia. I take a moment to recognize the traditional owners of this land, the custodians of the waterways, the systems, the people of the Great Kulin Nation in which I live and work. I also extend my welcome to those around the world who are tuning in from almost every corner of the globe, every shoreline, every waterway, and every community. I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Tierney, who is a National Geographic explorer, a marine biologist, and a superstar of the sea. And together we have been working to present an opportunity, a platform for those of us to come together in celebration, but also, in addition to being a platform, to offer and extend a gift of community, a place where we can celebrate and share our stories, our visions, and our memories in order to prepare for future Women of Sea and Space exploration missions.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I am so excited for everyone to be here and to launch our amazing event, which will take place over today and the next day as we go on this expedition together. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jane Lubchenco. Now, Dr. Lubchenco is a legend in the ocean world. She's a renowned environmental scientist with deep experience in the worlds of science, academia, and government. She's an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences, one of the most highly cited ecologists in the world. Jane is a true champion of science and has worked assiduously to build strong bridges between scientists and society. And as part of President Obama's Science Dream Team, she served as the Undersecretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere and as Administrator for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, better known as NOAA, from 2009 to 2013. She's a marine ecologist, environmental scientist by training with immense experience and expertise in the ocean. And her numerous attributes have earned her the title by some as the bionic woman of good science. So without further ado, I give you Dr. Jane Lubchenco.
Thank you so much, Tierney, and welcome everybody to Tektite 2020. I'm going to share my screen with all of you because I have a few slides to share. So bear with me for just a second. Here we go. Okay, Tierney, can you see this? So we are celebrating the Women of Sea and Space today and tomorrow. 50 years ago, 5 brave women swam into history, becoming the first all-female saturation diver team. For 10 days, they explored and conducted scientific experiments in the vicinity of their underwater home, which sat 43 feet deep in the US Virgin Islands. 7 years earlier, my 5 sisters and I were reveling in our own water habitat, a lake on the outskirts of Denver, Colorado. The idea of female pioneers pushing the boundaries of ocean exploration and science would have seemed quite natural and very appealing to us, thanks in large part to visionary and loving parents who encouraged us to dream and empowered us to explore. So much so that by the year of the historic Tektite II Mission 6 expedition, I had completed my first year of graduate school in marine ecology at the University of Washington, having fallen in love with life in the ocean and raring to explore what lies beneath. So for many of us, the 5 women aquanauts of Tektite II seemed like the most logical thing in the world and simultaneously very thrilling. But I think it's hard to appreciate today how bold and daring this grand adventure was, and the extent to which it helped upend societal attitudes and expectations of women. Against the backdrop of these 5 pioneers in their living quarters, perhaps a personal story might help transport us back to that era. 2 years after Tektite, having completed my master's degree at University of Washington, I sat with the rest of the new incoming class of graduate students at an Eastern US university. The faculty member who was welcoming this new incoming class said to us, "Welcome everyone, we're so excited you're here. Take a look around the room and you will see that about half of you are men and half of you are women." Although I think probably at the time he probably said girls. At any rate, he said, "This is a historic moment for us. This is the first time this has ever been true of our incoming class of graduate students. And we want you to know why we have this balance, this 50-50 balance." He said, "We have discovered from past experience that the men graduate students are not happy unless there are women in their classes. Now, we don't expect all of you to finish, but we welcome you anyway and wish you the best of luck." So that gives you just an inkling into some of the attitudes toward women and their capabilities. But in the face of this all too common perception that women simply couldn't cut it, the Tektite women proved on a very public stage that they could excel in what had previously been an all-male world. Certainly, there had been a number of individual women pioneers who demonstrated their abilities to do science and exploration. But something about the combination of a whole team of women, all women, living underwater in a foreign habitat, conducting science, fired the public imagination, and equally importantly, paved the way within federal agencies to regularly include women in aquatic and also space missions. And indeed, the simple record of the percent of female NASA astronauts shown in light blue here by years tells a striking story. And we are fortunate to be able to hear more from some of these women. And thus our celebrations today include the women pioneers in both space and the ocean. And we are thrilled to hear from so many of them over the next few days. Their inspiration continues with new innovative expeditions, such as the Sedna Epic expeditions. Since over 2014, over 1,000 Inuit youths, girls, and elders have participated in the Arctic expeditions, continuing the tradition of women pioneers, female role models, empowering youth, and pushing boundaries. So these pioneers in space and the ocean have not only produced new inspiration and science, but a new understanding of ourselves, of the connectedness of people around the world, and our impact on and dependence on the natural world. Both astronauts and ocean explorers are helping us understand our place in the world. And one of the new narratives that is emerging is around that place in the world and how we think about the ocean. Because I'm a marine biologist, I'm going to focus on the ocean for a minute and suggest to you that we are in the process of seeing the evolution of a new ocean narrative. For the vast period of humans on planet Earth, the ocean was seen as so immense, so bountiful, endlessly resilient, it was deemed too big to fail. That narrative has fallen by the wayside in the last decades as it has become increasingly obvious that our impact on the ocean has been quite substantial. In fact, so much so and in so many ways that many people are suggesting that now the ocean is just impossibly broken. The drivers are too complex. There are too many problems that are going on. And the new narrative that has emerged is that the ocean may be too big to fix. I see a third new narrative emerging, though. It says that the ocean is actually so central to our health, to our own well-being, to food security, to solutions to climate change. It provides a path to a smarter, wiser, and more sustainable future. In other words, this new narrative is that the ocean is not too big to fail. It's not too big to fix. It is too big to ignore. So I think looking across all that we have learned and seen since in the last 50 years since Tektite II, it's pretty clear that we need exploration. We need it to survive. We need it to inspire. We need it to thrive. It's also clear we have come very, very far, but there is so much more to do, to explore, to cherish, and to be good stewards. I am just thrilled to listen to the rest of the presentations. And so without further ado, I will turn the podium back over to the moderators. Thank you all and have a wonderful next set of interactions and presentations. I think it'll be very inspirational. Dr. Pell, over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lubchenco. And your words hit home with a great many truths. Not only are we needing to change the narrative and ensure that our ocean custodianship continues, but the role of women in both exploration, championing further advancement, but also championing the powerful Mother Ocean herself is incredibly important. So thank you for your words of encouragement and this introduction. We're now going to head forward into an overview from Meghan O'Hara and Dr. James Merle Thomas and their wonderful Tektite Revisited. Oh, my apologies. Before that, we are going to go directly to William Lawrence, or Bill Todd, who has been working both with NOAA and NASA. He was the project manager of the exploration analogs at the NASA Johnson Space Center. He grew up in the age of the Apollo when his father was employed in the space sector, and he from a very young age has been captivated by both sea and space environments. He now works with NASA and initiated and leads what we call the NASA Extreme Environment Mission Operations, or NEEMO, underwater at the Aquarius Underwater Laboratory, using the analog space of oceans in preparation for human spaceflight. My apologies for the introduction there, Bill.
No worries.
I'm out of sync, but you're not, and I'm glad you can join us.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Good morning. It's great to be here. It's an honor to be here to be part of this celebration of sea and space exploration, and specifically celebrating the achievements of Tektite Mission 6 and all of the things that they have done, the remarkable achievements that contribute to our operations in sea and space to these days. I was fortunate enough to grow up in Cocoa Beach, Florida, watching the Apollo launches from the beach, going single file from school down to the beaches to watch the Apollo launches, and watching TV on Sunday night in black and white, watching Jacques Cousteau and the Silent World, and spending my summers snorkeling in the Florida Keys, just a few miles from where the Aquarius Reef Base undersea habitat sits now. So I was immersed at an early day in these wonderful environments and extreme environments of sea and space, and it set a bit with me very, very early on. That's exactly what I want to do. I want to work in these places, and I want to learn all about them and be able to thrive in those environments. And as time went on, I found myself working at the Johnson Space Center in spaceflight training in the astronaut training division, which was an awesome place to start a career, working with astronauts, training them to fly the space shuttle. And a lot of what we did was fairly intense training in sophisticated simulators that were very much like the shuttle itself. But the interesting thing was, at the end of the day, we would all go home. And what we were missing in that training was an opportunity for the crew that were going to be flying anytime soon to spend some time together and strengthen their crew dynamic, kind of a little bit on the human performance side of things. There was not that much of that. So I was very lucky to have a good friend that I visited often in the Florida Keys, and that's Jan Koblick, a Tektite pioneer. And he taught me a lot about undersea habitation and the Tektite program, and through Living and Working the Sea by Jim Miller and Jan Koblick, what I call the Bible of undersea living and working, I learned much more about Tektite II and Mission 6 and all the contributions that mission made. And that really resonated with me on the psychological human performance studies that they did and how they related to the mission in the extreme environment. So now I was building a plan to come forward with some type of vehicle to give our crews that type of training. A plan was hatched for an undersea habitat, try to get NASA to also explore undersea, both sea and space. Of course, the isolation, the extremity, the adherence to procedures, the tight timeline, and the fact that you can work inside and outside the habitat, all those things, plus the fact that there's true consequences to your actions. You can get hurt or die, was very relevant when I went to management and tried to convince them that we should be doing this. But the other really important thing that I took with me in my quiver was the fact that this had been done by Mission 6 in Tektite. And I used the stories of the testing that was done, the human performance and behavior testing that was done then, and the fact that they were doing relevant ecological science on their sea walks. And I used those to help convince NASA management that this was something that we should be doing. And fortunately, it worked. So some 20 years later now, we're up to Mission 23, which we did last summer, which in fact happened to be an all-female NASA crew, which I'm very proud to say that I kind of took a play from the Tektite II Mission 6 playbook. It's something I always wanted to be part of, and all 4 of our NASA crew were females, led by Samantha Cristoforetti from ESA. So that was a very exciting mission. It was also by design 10 days in length, and we did very similar things what was done 50 years earlier. The same types of performance studies, the same type of science, just in a little bit different way for a different reason. So I want to just tell you a little bit about a day in the life there on Aquarius in one of these missions, which is very fast paced. And typically we send 2 of our crew out on EVAs, extravehicular activities, where we go into the water column and perform space-like tasks. In our case, we're actually walking on the seafloor, and we're wearing Kirby Morgan helmets and not scuba, but we're saturation diving, and we're wearing helmets and walking on the seafloor at 1/6 gravity, performing relevant space-like tasks and trying to achieve these within a short timeline, and speaking with mission control the whole time. And one of the experiments that we did, a very highly technical and complex device that we use as an analog for exploration of the moon and how we will interface with scientific equipment, was a device that was used to measure the health of the corals. That device was very sophisticated, and the person that developed and designed that device and came to our missions for 3 missions, trained the astronaut crew. That electrical engineer was also a Tektite II Mission 6 crew person 50 years earlier, Alina Szymant. So it's kind of a full circle legacy for me there, and I really appreciate how we can trace back to Mission 6 and have somebody participating all these years later in that. By the way, Jane mentioned how many females had flown in space, and I want to mention that in the 23 missions of Aquarius at NEEMO, or NEEMO at Aquarius, I should say, we've had 23 females, and 17 of those are astronauts, 15 of which have flown in both sea and space, or been in both sea and space, astronauts and aquanauts, which we call aquastronauts. So you heard it here. I don't know if it's going to catch on, but I've been trying to get it to catch on for about 10 years now. But I appreciate being here. And as we move forward into the Artemis program for lunar exploration and the Gateway program for Mars and beyond, it's great to know that when we're putting boots on the moon, that there will be a female that's wearing a pair of those boots. And perhaps there'll be not just an astronaut, but perhaps they will have trained undersea as an aquanaut. So it's an exciting time. We can draw direct parallels and a lineage back to Mission 6. Thank you for your contributions. They are significant to what we're doing today. And I want to finish up with just a quick note and congratulations in Kathy Sullivan and her achievements in both sea and space. I was fortunate enough to be her instructor on the Hubble Space Telescope quite a few years ago. And here she is going to the depths of the Marianas Trench. What an achievement that is. So I wish you the best of success today. I'm looking forward to listening to all the presentations as well. And I hope everybody has a great day. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bill. And quite right, a shout out to Kathy Sullivan. Amazing achievement. We did invite her here today. She's otherwise busy, but we said, of course, we will dedicate some time to her as well in celebration. And many of the people that you've trained with are going to also join us here over the next 2 days in celebration and describing all of the amazing activities that have occurred in Aquarius Reef as a direct result of the work that was established during the Tektite program. So thank you, Bill. We're now going to head on to an introductory video called Describing the Work of Tektite Revisited, a documentary by Meghan O'Hara and Dr. James Merle Thomas.
Monterey Bay. Throughout the past 10 years, we've written articles on the topic while convening exhibitions and conferences, and we are currently producing a feature-length documentary on the Tektite program with the support of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Named after meteorites that crashed into the Earth over 30 million years ago, Tektite was an underwater program that mirrored NASA's spaceflight program. And it was conceived as the agency transitioned from the shorter Mercury and Gemini missions of the 60s into a new era, one that involved living and working in space for up to months at a time. Through a program and habitat design that anticipated the Skylab missions of the early 1970s, Tektite used the ocean to model outer space at a fraction of the cost of a single Apollo mission. The Tektite program was a massive interagency collaboration that involved the Navy, the Department of Interior, and dozens of additional stakeholders. Foremost among these partners was the General Electric Company, whose engineers designed Tektite's novel habitat and furnished it with the latest GE appliances. It was a 2-silo, 4-room station, which could be pressurized and placed on the ocean floor. While the habitat was already a visually striking symbol for the program, equally memorable is Tektite's setting in the Caribbean. Situated in a remote corner of St. John in the U.S. Virgin Islands, the habitat was placed 50 feet beneath the ocean's surface, atop a thriving coral reef. Developed by the Navy Seabees, an adjacent base camp, which was built on the site of a former sugar plantation, housed dozens of medical staff and personnel who provided logistical support to America's aquanauts. Tektite's inaugural splashdown took place in February 1969, and it included the kind of fanfare that accompanied a NASA space launch. The mission featured press junkets and visits from dignitaries from the US and the Caribbean. The program's first 4 aquanauts lived underwater for 60 days. They were scientist divers drawn from the ranks of the Department of Interior and the Office of Naval Research. During the mission, they would leave the habitat daily to conduct biological and geological research on the ocean floor. It's important to remember that Tektite unfolded at a moment when the nation first began to acknowledge environmental problems like pollution. But while the habitat's position atop a reef helped to advance awareness of ecological research, a groundbreaking technological system made possible the program's other main objective, the constant psychological observation of aquanauts. Here, Tektite psychologists collected reams of data on their subjects, who lived in a futuristic habitat that bristled with microphones and closed-circuit cameras.
One of the reasons NASA was so interested in Tektite is because it wanted to better understand how aquanauts functioned as individuals and in small groups, particularly in isolated and extreme environments. So they gathered and analyzed data across multiple missions, and the mountain of data began to reveal patterns, knowledge about human actions, postures, leisure activity, habits, and interpersonal interactions. These insights were vital for architects as they designed NASA's subsequent spacecraft, and valuable to the agency as it began to select crews for longer space flights. By any number of measures, Tektite 1 was a success. The habitat functioned. There were no significant medical issues, save a few earaches. The experiment proved that it was possible for humans to undergo a prolonged saturation dive and live in underwater habitat for months on end. It also showed that it was possible to perform significant scientific research on the ocean floor from a habitat. Nearly everyone involved started looking for a way to make a Tektite sequel.
While Tektite 1 focused mostly on exploring the physical limitations of a single record-setting dive, Tektite 2 emphasized research, rotating over 50 scientists through the habitat across a total of 11 missions, each lasting about 2 weeks. Just as the Apollo era gave way to the age of Aquarius, the heroic explorer was updated and recast as a scientist researcher who lived within his or her field of study.
All of which brings us to the historic event that has brought us here today. The July 1970 Tektite mission, conducted 50 years ago this month.
Like the other Tektite II missions, the all-female mission included 5 members, each accomplished in their chosen field. Anne Hurley Hartline and Alina Szymant were graduate students at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography. Renata Troy held a doctorate in oceanography and taught at Tulane. Dr. Sylvia Earle, a marine biologist, held appointments at the Los Angeles County Museum of Natural History, Harvard, and Berkeley. And Margaret Ann Peggy Lucas, who was recruited from a graduate program in ocean engineering at the University of Delaware, served as the habitat engineer.
Looking at the documentation from the 1970s, it's immediately apparent that both the organizers and the press co-produced a spectacle. Tektite's 5 aquanauts routinely photographed like swimsuit models rather than scientists, a practice that generated immense publicity for the program, but ultimately distracted from its scientific accomplishments. One way to think about this extreme visibility is to consider how it related to a longer history of invisibility and exclusion, and specifically the way that women had been marginalized within NASA's culture since the 1950s.
Despite the constant intrusions from the press, it's important to emphasize that the all-female mission was a resounding scientific and operational success. In fact, NASA found that Tektite's all-female crew routinely outperformed their male counterparts in nearly every category, from time spent in the water, to effective research communication, to the management of interpersonal relationships.
I think all of us are in concurrence in wishing to make clear that we were there primarily as scientists, and only secondarily, if a minor consideration was that we were there as women.
If we're going to try to develop and grow animals in the ocean to feed the people and the overpopulation problem, we have to know how to grow them and what they depend on.
As an ecologist, I'm very concerned about community structure and interrelationships among the animals down there.
We could have never obtained the same amount of information in 2 weeks period working from the surface. It would have taken us at least, I would say, half a year.
Tektite in general was great, and as everyone said, we all want to go back again.
But the achievements of the mission didn't end with splash-ups or press conferences.
It's for these reasons that the mission holds such historic significance. It prompted a broader reconsideration of the duties that women had occupied in science and research-related fields.
While attempts were made throughout the 1970s and 80s to reestablish Tektite as an educational project in the San Francisco Bay, the habitat was never submerged again. However, the program inspired a number of influential aquatic research programs, many led by Tektite veterans. Ultimately, the program's most lasting impact can arguably be found in the lives and careers of the participants themselves.
At a personal and individual level, Tektite's legacy is one of trailblazing. In addition to its obvious impact on marine science and ocean exploration, the program accelerated countless careers in academia, engineering, and science, as well as leadership roles at federal agencies. I like to imagine a rippling wave of influence expanding out from St. John as the over 500 people who took part in Tektite move forward into the world. These next 2 days are a wonderful opportunity to reflect on and celebrate that legacy.
As this short film suggests, there's so much more to the story that we're not able to tell here. So with that in mind, stay tuned for our forthcoming feature-length documentary. And if you want, stay informed and get in touch with us directly at tektiterevisited.com. And without further ado, please join us as we make history, and for the first time in 50 years, bring together the members of the historic all-female mission and a cast of equally legendary aquanauts and alumni from Tektite. Hello and good morning, everyone. I'm waiting for Meghan to join me here. She will be stepping in just 1 second. 1 second. And Joe, I'm not sure if you're able to hear me, but I'm not seeing anyone else on the screen.
Hey, James, we're just waiting for Meghan to pop in, and then I'll bring her up full screen for us.
Okay, sure thing. Sounds good. Joe, Meghan says she's waiting.
Good morning.
Hi, Meghan. Good morning.
Thank you, Sarah Jane and Tierney, for having us here today. I'm Meghan O'Hara
I'm assistant professor of documentary filmmaking at Cal State Monterey Bay. The presentation you just saw was a collaboration with me and my partner, James Merle Thomas.
Hi, and good morning, everyone. My name is James Merle Thomas. And as you heard from our video, I'm a professor of art history at the Tyler School of Art and Architecture at Temple University.
And we're going to begin today. We have a number of people to introduce, so we're going to get started with that. I just want to, just a little bit of process. I just want to let you know that you can ask questions. We're going to kick it off with a few questions after we introduce our panelists. But if you have any questions, please add them to the chat, and we will look at those questions as we get into our panel. Okay, so we have quite a bit of accomplishments to describe to you at this time. So I'm going to let Jim start, and then we will get, I will join in after that.
Thanks, Megan. I'm going to jump right in, and I'll begin with the caveat that if I were to list the accomplishments of all of the aquanauts who are going to be joining us today on the panel, that would take the entire time of the panel. So forgive me as I condense some of these biographies and get right down to the business of welcoming our aquanauts and a legendary Tektite alum to today's conversation. I also want to begin with a bit of an acknowledgement in recognizing the accomplishments of Dr. Renata Schlenz-Troy, who was a member of the historic all-female mission in 1970 and who passed away in 2017. After completing her doctorate in ocean biology, Dr. Troy came to the Tektite program in her early 30s with well over 5 years of diving experience already, some of which involving work with Dr. Cousteau. And at the time of the mission, Dr. Troy was a faculty member at Tulane University in New Orleans. She was an admired researcher and beloved professor at the College of the Mainland in Galveston, Texas, where she taught anatomy and physiology for 30 years. Moving on to today's panel, it is with great pleasure that I introduce to today's conversation the members of the all-female team of 1970, and whose ranks include Dr. Sylvia Earle, also known as Her Deepness, who serves as the president and chairman of Mission Blue, an explorer in residence at the National Geographic Society. Dr. Earle is also founder of the Deep Ocean Exploration Research Incorporated and former chief scientist of NOAA. Dr. Earle is the author of hundreds of publications and leader of more than 100 expeditions with over 7,500 hours underwater. She's a graduate of Florida State University and holds multiple advanced degrees from, among other institutions, Duke University, and is the recipient of dozens of honorary degrees. Her research mounts a legendary career regarding the ecology and conservation of marine ecosystems and the development of technology for accessing these areas as well as the deep sea. She's the subject of the Emmy Award-winning Netflix documentary Mission Blue, the recipient of many honors and awards, far too many to list here in their entirety, but I note among them a designation as a living legend by the Library of Congress, the 1996 Explorers Club Medal, and the National Geographic 2013 Hubbard Medal. After completing her Tektite duties, Dr. Anne Hurley Hartline received her doctorate in biological oceanography in 1972 from Scripps, and after several postdoctoral positions, served as faculty researcher at Moss Landing and San Jose University. In the early 1980s, Dr. Hartline returned to higher education, and in a career move, earned her law degree from Georgetown University. Among other law-related jobs she held, she was an associate at the firm of Skadden, Arp, Slade, Meagher & Flom, and served as director and chief counsel of the EPA and the environmental project of the National Association of Attorneys General, and eventually served as a trial attorney in the environmental enforcement section of the DOJ. Since retiring from the Department of Justice, Dr. Hartline has acted as a steward of the California coastline, serving on the boards of a number of environmental and arts-related nonprofits. Pioneer in the study of physiological ecology and reproductive biology of Caribbean coral reef, Dr. Alina Szymant has spent 5 decades in the field. After earning a bachelor's in biology from the University of Puerto Rico in the 1960s, a master's degree in marine biology from Scripps in 1970, Szymant completed her doctorate in biological oceanography from the University of Rhode Island. She is currently retired and an adjunct professor at the University of North Carolina in Wilmington, where she led many projects. Notable among them is the development of an innovative diver portable underwater respirometer that measures coral in its natural environment. And in turn, this technology has developed into her latest endeavor. She is the CEO of Kisme Instruments, which capitalizes on this technology and makes it available in a widespread commercial setting. And we'll be hearing more about that later on in the setting. She served on the Scientific Technical Advisory Committee to the Water Quality Plan for the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary throughout the 1990s and 2000s, and has participated in numerous regional, national, and international workshops to consider issues affecting coral ecosystems. Before joining faculty in North Carolina, Szymant was a professor of marine biology at the University of Miami's Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Science, research faculty at Florida State, and research staff at the University of Puerto Rico as well. She was awarded the AAUS Scientific Diving of Lifetime Achievement Award in 2013. And last but not least, rounding out the beginning of our panel is Peggy Lucas-Bond, an ocean engineer, software engineer, aquanaut, and environmental and energy journalist. Peggy received her bachelor's in electrical engineering from Villanova University, and as we mentioned in our film earlier, was called from the ranks of the elite of the ocean engineering program, where she had earned her master's at the University of Delaware to participate in the Tektite program. Prior to her time as an aquanaut, she was an assistant scientific coordinator for the Tektite II Project, and she worked as a marine resource specialist at the University of Hawaii, as a professor of computer science at the American University of Paris, and served as a reporter for the Financial Times business publications, covering a wide portfolio of topics ranging from energy, pharmaceuticals, and biotechnology from her time in France. She's been active in efforts to protect marine and land environments worldwide. And I note a fact that is not listed on her bio here, that she served on a number of prominent architectural review committees as an intercapacity, as an expert in engineering, as NASA and other space agencies developed space stations throughout the 1970s. So with these extremely impressive biographies now behind us, I'd like to turn and just welcome all of the aquanauts as we make history and bring you together for the first time in 50 years.
Welcome. So jumping right in, we're gonna do this in a conversational way. So if you had something, an answer to a question, feel free to jump in, and I'll try to bring you in if you hadn't had something to say. But I just wanna talk a little bit about where each of you were before Tektite started. How did you hear about the program? How did you become involved? What kind of work were you doing prior to becoming involved? And what did you hope to get out of it?
You want me to start?
Sure. Sylvia. Yes, thank you.
I was at Harvard. There's a notice on the bulletin board announcing the opportunity to spend a couple of weeks underwater as a scientist. We had to make up projects, research projects, submitted to the Smithsonian Institution for review. I submitted a project with fellow scientists, all male, all ichthyologists. I was a botanist, and we wanted to work together to look at the ecology. But when the application arrived, the idea of men and women living together underwater was simply not acceptable. The idea of having women at all, I think, was novel. You're going to hear later, I think, from Jim Miller. He can give his perspective on it, but legend has it that after some reflection, he said something like, well, half the fish are female. I guess we could put up with a few women. And that became history. You know, I had to give up on the idea of working with the ichthyologists who were intended to be part of the team that I would be a part of. They were all later aquanauts with other teams, and it was so great that we were able to assemble from the other applicants who had come in and were well qualified scientifically and in terms of diving experience, and none of us had met the others before we had a chance to meet in connection with the project. Actually, it was in Chicago, and we, I think, forged a great friendship as well as a team working together.
That's good.
I in the process of this whole experience of starting at Harvard and then moving to California, right in the middle of all this, I became spent this time, 2 weeks of training and 2 weeks underwater and a bit of time afterwards, all immersed in this wild and crazy project.
Alina and Anne, if I could jump in, I'm really curious to hear a little bit about what the institutional climate was like at Scripps at the time. I mean, were you aware of one another at the time? Had you had much interaction, and how could you describe a little bit of the pipeline, how that evolved from Southern California then to the Caribbean?
So Anne and I were actually good friends at Scripps. We'd been hiking together. Her husband at the time, Peter Hartline, you know, we were all friends, and I give credit to Anne and Peter for getting us involved in Tektite. You know, you got to think back to the times. Sylvia said she saw something on a bulletin board. There's no email, there's no Facebook, there's no, you know, how do you find out about things? And we were graduate students. So Anne and Peter came across, I think Anne told me that one of our professors, I'm guessing it's Ed Fager, told her about it, and they had just come back from a honeymoon in the Pacific and saw these little fishes aggregating and hiding, going in and out of coral. So they came to me and said, hey, you're a Caribbean specialist. There's this program here. What do you think about working together? Do you know if there are similar type of fish communities? And so, yeah, I said, great, fantastic. So, you know, at Scripps, we had no women faculty. I was a year or so ahead of Anne. The year I came into Scripps, there were 7 of us female graduate students. By the end of the first quarter, there were only 4 of us left. And I think of all of the women that came in that first year of 7 students, I think I ended up leaving with a master's instead of my doctorate. I think 2 others finished PhDs. So it was not real women friendly. There were male faculty members that basically I wanted to work with them, and it was like, nope, we don't take women. You know, like I won't mention any names, but I wanted to be a fish person. But like, no, they don't have women. They may have a woman technician, but not a woman graduate student. Women were discouraged from going out on the research vessels unless they were a secretary. There's lots of little scandals there we won't talk about. But so the atmosphere was not very supportive of women. The first summer I was in graduate school, I tried to go on the Cal Coffee cruises. They were looking for students to man the ships. And another female student, Barbara Somrosky, and I, we both wanted to go on these, you know, they paid well and they were really cool experience. We're told, I'm sorry, they're not taking any women because they're disruptive to the crew. So one of my roommates, Tanya Atwater, she's a geophysicist, sorry, and she needed to be a chief scientist on one of the big script ships for her research, cutting edge research she was doing up in the Juan de Fuca Ridge. And the captain of one of the big script ships, Captain Morgan, said, no way, I'm not going to have a woman chief scientist. This is not going to happen. And so luckily, the times were beginning to change at Scripps, at least, you know, it was all male, but they were beginning to see the value of, or appreciate what we were, how hard we worked and our, you know, our dedication to the work. And so they told the captain, well, if you don't want to have Tanya as chief scientist, you can resign. But, and so she did become the chief scientist, probably the first woman chief scientist on a major Scripps research expedition. So yeah, those were the times. That was what we expect to get out of it. An adventure.
Peggy or Anne, do you want to?
Yeah,
add to that?
Let me follow up a little bit on that. How did we hear about it? I mean, as Alina said, it was my husband, Peter Hartline, at the time, and Dr. Peter Hartline, and I went to put together a puzzle which brought in Alina and Art Fluxing and Peter, as we were all down in the Virgin Islands. They were our support team, the two guys. But I heard of it not because I saw it on a bulletin board, but because Professor Rosenblatt came up, and I don't know whether he was looking for me specifically or I just ran into him in the hall and he said, I hear that there's a project that wants 2 girl divers. Why don't you look into it? So we went and quickly looked into it, and there we were, a little surprised at this, but quite honestly, my biggest my biggest interest in the project was probably because in the lab where I worked, there were 3 males that had been saturated in one of the Sea Lab missions. And I admired them greatly. And I figured the Navy was never going to let me get into Sea Lab. So I figured, maybe this is the next best thing. But it was, as I said, it was an adventure. It was very exciting. I mean, the biology was very interesting too, but I think my first reaction was diving.
Thank you. Peggy, you were at the University of Delaware. Do you want to talk about how you came to be involved?
Certainly. It was a very exciting time for me in a way that I was not involved in underwater anything. I was a computer programmer writing simulation programs for my master's degree. But as an engineer, there were 2 other students with me at the time, and the 2 guys and I were required to go to a professional engineering meeting, and where Tektite I was explained to us. And after watching the gentleman present, and I was walking down the hall with my 2 fellow students, I said, boy, that's really fun. I might like to do that. And almost magically, a month later, my thesis advisor came to me, and Dr. Bill Gaither said, Peggy, do you dive? I said, well, no, but I swim a lot. I've been a lifeguard. And he said, well, how would you like to be the female engineer on a women's team on the new Tektite program? And I said, well, absolutely, I would love to be. And I, at that point, started learning, was put into a diving program in Washington, D.C., and began my diving career there. And I continued with my master's program, and then I was able to be in the Tektite office in Washington, D.C., working with the scientific coordinator, John Vanderwalker. And I spent a lot of time in the water, spent time doing my master's degree at the same time, and then went on and became the engineer. And it was a wonderful experience, and I'm glad I did it. And I got to meet all these wonderful other women that I never would have met before.
And could I just intersect?
Please do.
Peggy, they said at the time it's easier to train an engineer to be a diver than to train a diver to be an engineer.
Well, that was true.
I'm loving this of the kind of I'm loving the idea of this back and forth, and that actually gets me. I think it gets us right to the heart of the issue. And the caveat here is that Meghan and I, when we first started researching this program, we absolutely fell in love with Tektite. And I think part of that is that it represented a world unto its own. I think the first conversation when we had with Alina some years ago, she described this moment in St. John like MASH without the war. And so I'm just really struck. There's so much to this, right? There's the absolutely futuristic habitat that GE built, with the Stouffer's meals and the GE appliances. There's the kind of freewheeling vibe of the base camp itself. There's of course the reef, and then there's the Chicago ticker tape parades and the spectacle that went with it. And I love the idea of hearing all of you interact as a group and really kind of playing on each other in thinking about what remain as some of your most vivid memories from that summer in 1970.
Well, there was a time that Peggy and I were out, and we were not using the wonderful rebreathers on this dive. We were using the double tanks, and each tank at the time, instead of being joined, had separate regulators. So when you finished the air on one side, you picked up the other regulator for the other tank. And we learned so much. But one regulator on my second tank had been dragging along unnoticed and picked up sand that clogged it, so that when we were ready to go back home, I switched to the second tank, put my regulator in the mouth, and it was dead. There was no air because we hadn't noticed that the sand in the regulator had caused all the air to escape. Anyway, so there was Peggy. She was a newly minted scuba diver, and we had just met each other a few weeks before. But we were far away from our home base. We had to, do what we've been trained to do, buddy dive on the way back home, if you will. No problem. I mean, Peggy, you just handed me your precious air. I took a sip, gave it back to you. Aren't you glad I gave it back to you? We made our way home. It was no big deal because we had rehearsed the possibility that something would go wrong, and something did go wrong, but we were ready to cope with it.
Right, and what Sylvia's talking about was one of the things that it's totally like NASA and the engineers at NASA that decide, and not just the NASA, but whole project and the dive people had decided that unlike most times when you have two tanks and you're diving, you have one regulator. And so on this one, we had two tanks and two regulators. So every time we went out, we had the safety of having extra regulator. If something happened to the first one, you couldn't switch your tanks. But the rule also was when you went out, you had a safety on each tank. And when you used up the air in your first tank, you then switched to your second tank. You never used the safety on your first.
That's right.
So we were still working with safeties. And I think at one point, finally, almost back there, we were getting calm enough that I realized that I could turn my safety on my first tank. And then we ended up with two regulators, but they were both my regulators, not Sylvia's.
It's true. So
I think one of the greatest things for me, when I went to Scripps, I wanted to work with fishes. And unfortunately, there were 7 male graduate students coming in that same year to work with Dr. Rosenblatt. And he never had anybody, no females in his lab. So I went off to do other things. But I've always loved fishes. That was my first experience diving ever, was when I was 18, and Dr. Peter Glenn put a tank on my back and held my hand and took me diving. And my ears were hurting so bad, and I was scared because I didn't know what to do. I had nothing training. I was in a summer marine biology course. And I was sort of beginning to hyperventilate. And then this parrotfish swam in front of me. And it was like, look at that. And that was it. I was hooked. So even though at Scripps I was disappointed because I didn't get a chance to work with fishes, I've always had this interest. And it was so wonderful being like, we were in the fishbowl and the fishes were on the outside. So, you'd sit at the window and the fishes are coming up to you. There was this photo I kept trying to take of the fish coming up and looking at its picture in the fish book that was right on the windowsill. Never quite got it, but, and just having all that time to, they're the birds of the ocean, right? They're the things that have around all these fantastic behaviors. So all of you bird watchers out there, it's really fish watching is such an entertaining thing. I love the corals, and my head is always buried into the corals, but really when I'm not working, I love to just photograph the fishes and watch their behaviors. That was, to me, the greatest thing that I got out of Tektite, I think, is that amount of time. I remember, Sylvia, you took us on a dive one morning to see the garden eels down by where the sewage came out. I remember it was way down there. But that was such an amazing experience, seeing these little fishes coming up and grabbing plankton, and the big tarpon that came around the habitat at night, feeding on all the fishes attracted to our lights.
So for me, one of the takeaways was getting to know fish as individuals. Remember Puff, the great green moray?
Yeah.
And the tarpon, there are 5 tarpon that would come out at night in particular and swim around. And the 5 gray angelfish. We'd get up really early in the morning to see the creatures that were night fish, and they'd come out in the morning. They're day fish and night fish. we were
changing of the guard.
The changing of the guard, right. And sometimes we'd find crevices that were occupied by one group at night and another group by day, sort of hot bedding on the reef, changing out who got to sleep in the place by day or night. Anyway, it was a breakthrough. I'd had a lot of time underwater before Tektite, more than 1,000 hours, and I had experienced the occasion of being at sea with 70 guys on an expedition to the Indian Ocean in 1964. And to your point about how it was unusual for women to be accepted, let alone under the sea. But I really am eager to hear Jim Miller's perspective on this and why we were allowed to go at all, because there were no women astronauts at the time. And years later, George Bond, Papa Topside, saturation diving pioneer, we were at a meeting of some sort, and he took me aside and he said, I think during the Tektite Project, your team and the women's team, you did really well, but I have to say, I really objected to having me, Sylvia, participate. So I was not against women, but I didn't want you to go. I said, why? He said, well, you're a mom. You had kids. I said, so there were guys who were fathers. Why discriminate against me because I had kids? He said, well, we didn't have all the answers about it. It was really, there were dangers, and if something had happened to you as a mother, it would have really been bad for the program. So the rest of you were expendable, but I wasn't, because I had kids. Anyway.
That's a really, I think Sylvia raises a really important point, and I think we could spend all day talking about so many of the biological and ecological and technical aspects, but Sylvia raised, I think, a really interesting point, and that's the broader context that's happening right at this moment. We shift out of 60s and the Apollo era into the age of the Aquarius, right? And we think about, Earth Day is 1970. This is right at the moment when the EPA and NOAA are then established. But it's also, it's 2 years before the National Organization of Women successfully brought NASA to the table to talk about the Equal Opportunity Act, right? And so there's this other aspect of, I think, what Sylvia brings up as the attitudes towards feminism at the time, the role of women in science at that time. And so that's a staggering story to hear you mention, Sylvia, about the George Bond didn't want you because you were a mother, right? And it brings up such a fascinating sense because, some of you at the time were raising families, some of you were in the middle of graduate degrees, some of you were still very much in your studies, and I'm curious.
So were the guys, but there was just kind of a special attitude about women that made us like more than our male counterparts.
And I think that's part of society at the time. Remember, women's roles as stay at home, have that small bill thing, have dinner on the table when the men come home, and men are there to protect women. Sea Lab was ended when there was a death, right? So one of the guys died, and that everything ended. And so the idea, women were not allowed to fly. They were women in the Vietnam War, but they weren't flying the warplanes or in combat. They had a very limited role in combat, World War II, World War I, things like that. Women were on the front and were dying, but not, shooting the rifles. And so I think maybe this perception, based on your story, Sylvia, that they saw us as going into harm's way. I never felt that. I never felt afraid. I never felt like, oh my gosh, this is dangerous. But diving at the time was considered dangerous. A few years later, my first husband and I went to buy our first house. And when we were applying for the mortgage, they required us to get a special insurance program because I was a scuba diver, because that was seen as like an extra high risk, which nobody today would even think about it. But, scuba didn't even come about until 1955, right? So this is only like 15 years later that we were doing the saturation mission. So, the context of the times, people now don't understand what it was like back then. And one of my major concerns going forward, because there are so many potential affronts to women's rights now, is that we lose many of the gains that people take for granted now that could easily be undone.
For me, I think that one of the biggest problems I had with Tektite was, in fact, the emphasis on the women. I spent a lot of time trying to run away from the press. I hated that aspect of it. And I just found that there was this whole project that was full of all of these men doing very interesting science. And then there's us. And, I wanted to hear some more about what the men's teams were doing at the time. I didn't want to go to a parade in Chicago where everyone on State Street looked at us and said, what are they? And I found the experience, the whole saturation diving, the habitat and everything wonderful. It was the first time I ever had time to spend in warm water, which was a whole lot different than diving where I was usually diving.
Yeah.
And so it just, I don't know, for some reason that bothered me. And I guess unlike Alina, I'd never had a lot of problems at Scripps being a woman. I mean, I had a major professor who was incredibly supportive. He fought hard to actually get me on some ships by myself, being the only woman. And I was considered a diver there. And when I got back, I had to live down being an aqua babe.
Well, for me, as an engineer, it was somewhat different. I think engineers were a lot more easily accepted into the community of engineering because there were many engineers, not a lot at that time, but there had been a tradition of women in engineering. But the Tektite program for me was just absolutely a fantastic experience to learn that you could take care of something like the habitat. We had to learn all the systems, and now I don't even remember what the training was like, but I know I had spent time at General Electric and we had massive books, no computers to read on or anything. And the habitat was well designed, and it was just a engineering feat that was wonderful. The only thing that didn't work was the dumb waiter that brought the food down. So we had to have a man bring the food down, but we weren't supposed to watch him and we weren't supposed to talk to him. And, but it was one of those experiences that led you into being who you became. And I never spent a lot of time back in the water, but it gave me the opportunity to know that I could control everything and get everything done that needed to be done. And I didn't have discrimination that I can remember. And even when I worked for Westinghouse with the Navy, the only problem I ever had as being a woman was they never liked women to be on the subs when they were in dry dock. And I finally one time decided I had to go in to proof one of the designs that we had. And that was the last time I went. It was one of those kinds of experiences. You knew you weren't welcome, but then I didn't really want to be on one of those subs anyway. So from that day forward, I always sent one of my coworkers on to do the on-site work with the submarines.
Those submarines don't have windows.
No, they don't. And they smell bad.
I wanted to ask, building on both what Anne and Peggy have talked about, sort of what you did take forward from Tektite into your careers after Tektite, whether that's from the experience of being at the bottom of the ocean, working in the habitat, or actually even the experience of speaking about your work publicly. Were there things that you took from Tektite that into the careers that you guys then had?
Well, for me, as a scientist, it was a baptism by fire to come out of the Tektite Project and be faced with, banks of microphones, and you had to speak, even though I had never spoken to an audience larger than a small group of scientists. And then suddenly, not just thousands, but millions of people were listening to the news broadcast. I got to go on What's My Line? Oh my gosh, really terrifying. The Dick Cavett Show, things of that sort, way out of my league. And speaking to Congress after, and when we went to Chicago, we're made honorary citizens of Chicago, and the ticker tape parade down State Street, all of that. You had to adapt and overcome. You just become, realize you have a responsibility, and that it, constantly aware. It's not about you, Sylvia. It's about the ocean. And when you speak, so they want to know, did you use a hairdryer? Or did you wear lipstick? Okay, get over that. Let me tell you about the ocean and what it is that we saw there. So it was an opening to really communicate on a scale that was unprecedented. For me, it also led to other saturation dives. I've done it 10 times now. The Hydrolab, and we had the pleasure of diving together in the Hydrolab.
That wasn't exactly a luxury habitat.
It was more like camping than they called the Tektite Hilton, because we had all these prepared meals, and we had, a lot of things. We had our own engineer look after the place. Not with Hydrolab. We kind of had to do it ourselves. I learned a lot from Peggy about how the discipline that is necessary, and getting to know. I think the fact that we had time, it really, really was the gift of time to be able to see a place with greater clarity. You get to see how fish behave. You don't have to race back to the surface just as they're about to do something that you want to see, but you have to go because you've only got a 20-minute, passport to be at 100 feet or wherever. And I think the sadness for me is that the whole idea of saturation diving has not been retained within our nation as a priority, and even submarines have not been retained as the whole National Underwater Research Program that grew up as a consequence of Tektite. And for a while, the Hydrolab was supported by NOAA, and it was a vigorous uplifting for some years with the idea of how do we get people to live and work underwater. Just as we have astronauts high in the sky, we've gone over now to not have aquanauts celebrated underwater, but we have robots, we have satellites, and we have underwater remotely operated systems, autonomous underwater vehicles. But at least as a nation, we're not supporting having people either living underwater or in submarines. Most of that is happening through private initiative. I mean, Kathy Sullivan went high in the sky with public support, but it took an individual with the resources to develop, he didn't develop it, he bought a submarine to go to the deepest part of the ocean and took Kathy along, like getting into a taxi, let's go. But where is the initiative in our country to further the engineering skills? We're doing it to go up into space, not enough. I mean, we've backed off from that too, but to be able to have as a national commitment, taking humans underwater, using our brain power along with all of our technology, but to package.
Yeah, it's really important. It's really important, and it's one of those things that we were given an opportunity to do, and you went on and did something very, very different, just like I did. We didn't stay doing everything in the underwater.
Yeah. In fact, I stayed doing underwater things for about 10 years.
Yeah.
I did a couple of saturation dives. I did my thesis basically underwater all the time. And it was, I went on to be diving officer at Morris Landing Marine Lab. So, and then I went to law school.
Yeah. It's sort of unfortunate that the Hydrolab mission started a few years after Tektite, and it started out very primitive over in the Bahamas, and then moved to St. Croix. And it was a very successful program. And there were actually I had 3 missions in Hydrolab, and the second one we were all female, just ended up that way. It wasn't intentional, but the other ones were all co-ed. And then Hurricane Hugo came along and destroyed the site, and there was no will to recreate it. And then Aquarius came and was there for a long while and is still out there, but with very limited funding. I get mostly private funding now. So the whole underwater habitat thing, and I forget what year it was, 2000 more or less. I went to Japan, to JAMSTEC, the Japanese Marine Science Technology Center. Right. And it's in Yokohama. It's this amazing place. And they had visions for underwater cities. They have these mock-ups of underwater agriculture and mining. They had these lines of whale-like things at the entrance of bays to generate electricity to power underwater. They had rafts that went up and down with the oysters and the seaweed. So their vision, the decompression chamber that they had in this hangar was enough to have a party in. We would be able to social distance a group of 10 in there, but it was amazing. And then it all fizzled. They still do all these deep habitat, submersibles, but the idea of living underwater, it is costly.
But as costly as it fell into space, huh?
Yeah, it is. But I guess space is, we all look up to the stars, and it's this big mystery. So I don't know, but it's too bad. I think there's still an awful lot more to learn. I learned from my own research that it is limiting, though. There are a lot of projects that, for example, research projects, I was there during Aquarius and I'd go visit, but my stuff needed to be in lots of different places at the same time, or very short periods of time. And so you do need to really stick to where you were. There was a design for habitat that was going to be going up and down on legs, so they could easily move it and put it down in a new place and then move it. But it turned out that was the engineering part of doing that was very complicated and expensive. So they never did it. They just put it down and left it there.
Global. I mean, come on. I mean, it's all relative. And I think there is a place for being able to move around. We do that with submarines. I use lockout submarines so you can be transported under pressure, but you can go to ultimate depths if you stay at one atmosphere, but take your mind. That should not be a limitation. To take people anywhere on the planet underwater should be just so easy, and why it's taken us so long. I mean, James Cameron took 6 or 7 years to build a submarine. He really did get into the engineering part. And I got into the engineering part, not as an engineer, but working with engineers to build little submersibles, 1-person and 2-person, even 3-person subs, to extend our reach into the ocean. We need to go. We need to be there. There's no substitute. I love robots. I love having stations all over the place, like weather stations. But until we can actually freely take kids, take, CEOs, take politicians, take people down to get to know this planet from the inside out, we're still going to be behind the curve. I mean,
Sylvia, I think building on this idea of the kind of outward-facing stewardship of oceanography, the expanded context of subsequent habitats that come in the wake of Tektite, I think this is an excellent moment for us to bridge and to bring in 3 more voices so we can really even further enliven this conversation. So I'm going to bring in Ed, Jan, and Jim, and I will very briefly give bios, but I'm really interested in getting out of the way and letting this conversation unfold exactly as it's been happening. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Ed Clifton. Edward Clifton is a geologist and prominent and internationally acclaimed research scientist who is a leader in science in the USGS branch of the Western Coastal and Marine Geology team for over 2 decades, also serving as branch chief from 1978 to 1981. And he's currently an emeritus scientist with the department. He received a doctorate in geology from Johns Hopkins and a bachelor from geology at Ohio State. And we've had the pleasure of speaking with Ed a number of times. Ed holds the distinction of actually being involved with both years of Tektite as well, and we'll really be able to further sort of round out our discussion about the missions. Equally beloved is Jan Koblick, who is an alternate Aquanaut in Tektite I and a manager at Aquanaut for the 2nd year of the program. In 1972, in the wake of Tektite, Koblick designed and operated La Chalupa, which was another undersea lab. We mentioned these habitats that come in the wake of the program. And as many of us know, with great pleasure, La Chalupa lives on as the very famous Jules Undersea Lodge, the world's only undersea hotel, and from which one may order a pizza to be delivered from a scuba diver. The Jules Undersea Lodge is also the site of the MRDF, the Marine Resources Development Foundation, which is a award-winning environmental education facility that Koblick has developed for several decades, and which houses and educates more than 4,000 students a year. Throughout an illustrious career, in addition to managing and running this foundation, Koblick is an internationally recognized authority on marine resource planning and diving, served on committees throughout the world, and also served the governor of the Virgin Islands. And he is also co-author of a seminal book that has been mentioned a number of times during the panel this morning, namely Living and Working in the Sea, which is a definitive book on the history of saturation diving and underwater habitats. Which brings us to our last and by no means the least panelist today. It is with great pleasure that I bring into this group as well Dr. James Jim Miller, who is truly a champion and pioneer of undersea habitation. I mentioned that he's the co-author of this important tome with Jan, Living and Working in the Sea. Dr. Miller, who joins us this morning, is the founder of, in many ways, the Tektite missions. And he served not only as Deputy Project Director of Tektite I, but as Project Director of Tektite II, with deep affiliations with Sealab 2 as well, and was involved with the direction of the psychological programs. He was Director of Ocean Technology for the Department of Interior prior to the establishment of NOAA, and also served as an Aquanaut crew member of La Chalupa. And so without further ado, I'm going to get out of the way, and I actually am really excited to bring in this moment that many of us have been talking about now for several weeks. And I think it's a moment that Sylvia really wanted to help to catalyze, namely this idea of, Jim and Sylvia, I want to hear you two interact and talk about the historic nature of this mission and how that unfolded from both sides of the story. Sylvia kind of gave one version of that, and I'd love to hear the two of you interact on that. And Joe, you can pull me out of the mix. I'd love to see all of the Aquanaut.
So there was one discussion about rebreathers. Jim, you called me and said that there was some concern about whether we could handle rebreathers because they were so heavy. I think 70 pounds. And I said, well, how heavy are the double tanks? 65 pounds. So anyway, the idea that maybe women were not muscular enough to handle the rebreathers, or maybe not intellectually capable of understanding how to operate a rebreather, whatever it was, there was resistance. But in the end, we got to use them. It was great too. I don't think Anne needed a rebreather. There was one occasion where just on double tanks, I think she was able to squeeze 4 hours out of 2 tanks.
Yeah,
2 hours.
Only 2?
4 hours.
It was 2 hours to the minute because we were like sucking gas and we were freezing because we weren't trying to not to move so we wouldn't use too much air. But anyway, yeah.
4 hours one time because it was a challenge from one of the medical people that I couldn't do it. And I was lucky. I had really low metabolism. To be a diver at Scripps with low metabolism because you were always the last person to run out of air.
Well, you know you have gills. I know you have gills. Right here. So, Jim, what was it like? I mean, you didn't expect women to apply. I mean, it was not there was nothing in the application that was there on the bulletin board that said women need not apply.
That's right. And that was true. My background is quite different than any of yours. I went to Michigan State and got my 3 degrees there. And I had a double major, sort of, where one of them was physiological optics and the other was plane physiology. So after a short job as a claim adjuster getting out of school, I decided that wasn't for me. I'm going to sum this up very quickly. So I went back to Michigan State to their placement service, and I found an ad for a job at the Kresge Eye Institute in Detroit, which I lived at that time. And it said, wanted a girl with a chemistry degree. And they described the job a little bit, which was in physiological optics. So I called down there and I talked to Dr. Ludwig, and I said, I'm not a girl. He said, I can tell that on the phone. And I said, I'd like to meet you and discuss the job. Make a long story short, I had the job, worked in Detroit at their laboratories for about 3 or 4 months. And he said, we just new contract.
Can I interrupt you just for a second? Sorry to interrupt your story. We have such limited time. I wanted to ask, when did it become an idea to include women in the mission?
Well, at the time I was just talking that there wasn't any such mission. If you give me another couple of minutes, I'll get right to it. Okay? Okay, I don't hear anybody getting up and leaving yet. Anyway, I ended up at the Office of Naval Research and was asked to put together a group for Sea Lab 2 and Sea Lab 3. Many of the people you all have mentioned are Flexig and other people at Scripps. We're all on Sea Lab. Martin Wells was another one. And so that got me interested in the Navy's program. So I decided, well, if that's going to happen, I'm going to learn how to dive. So I went through the Navy 1-month diving program. And they never did give me a certification, but they gave me a piece of paper. So anyway, at the end of Sea Lab 2, I was asked to give a talk on the results of the studying the people living on the seafloor. These were all males of various ages. The heads of the 2 of the teams was 50 years old at the time. And so we put together a program with a couple of psychologists that worked for the Navy. And that got me interested in that end of the diving and stuff. So I suggested at this talk at the end at the NASA meeting, why don't we use diving, male and female diving, for astronaut training. So 3 days later, a meeting was called. We sent out proposals for a habitat. General Electric won that proposal and built a habitat, and you know the background of all of these things. And there was one other gentleman whose name hasn't come up. His name is Harold Goodwin. who works for the National Science Foundation. He and I and John Vanderwalker were the three people that first started talking about why don't we have a female team? And one thing led to another. And we went through all the questions and answers, you know, what if you can do this? What if you can do that? Is it going to be too much PR and so on? So we sent out a notice for proposals to be submitted. I came from a place that in the government, you submit a request for proposals. I don't remember how many we got, but and we did not say no women. So right from the beginning of Tektite, in my mind, women were not excluded in any way whatsoever. I took a lot of baloney with that attitude. This was 1970, 1969. Women who had not hit I should say it hit the fan more than it hit their qualifications. Anyway, I didn't know any of you at the time, but between John and Harold and myself, and later people said, "Oh, I know her," and so on. We ended up with the team, which turned out to be number 6. Team number 5, mission number 5, was supposed to be using a small habitat called the mini-TAC, which was designed for a 100-foot mission as part of Tektite. Well, a lot of technical problems were issued, and we had to cancel that. So I've had to explain this, you know, where's Team 5? Well, Team 5 was canceled. Near the end of all the missions, we decided we'll stick with 11 missions, and we had a 11th mission was a mission to test equipment for cameras, underwater use for cameras. There was a Flip Schulke, who was a well-known underwater photographer and so on. So that's how it evolved. It wasn't any magical trick to get women to go underwater. And it was obvious right away it was going to work. And so that's how the whole thing started.
I'd like to add something to that, Jim.
Sure, go ahead, John.
Well, there was a meeting because once the women team was decided upon, and I was very supportive of that, there had to be a meeting of all the program managers. That was GE and the Navy and Jim and myself. We each represented one. So the question was, you know, we got a lot of media coverage for Tektite 1.
Yeah.
How are we going to get a lot of media coverage for Tektite 2? Aha, an all-girls team. And that was the final support from everybody. They all agreed on that. So anybody who had it before,
Yeah, Peggy, go.
May I chime in for just a second? And I remember having heard the story of these meetings from Hal Goodwin, who was an incredible man.
Yeah.
Who worked for a Sea Grant with the National Science Foundation. And he remembers the meeting when it was finally decided, and they said, well, we can't find an engineer. And Hal piped up and he said, oh, I've got one at University of Delaware. And he really backed.
Yeah.
He said to me,
I thought that Brooks Tierney was the person that recommended you, Peggy. Brooks?
No, it was actually Hal. And Brooks Tierney, because I've been trying to remember his name. Yes, but he was the one who gave the original Tektite speech. So I guess he, at the University of Delaware, so he knew I was there, but Hal Goodwin also knew I was there because I was on a Sea Grant that he administered. And yes, the two of them were very, very supportive, but Hal was really supportive for all women in the whole project.
I used to get asked all the time, why do you want a woman's team? And I had to start cutting that off, being asked by the press. And I said, I would just say, why not? And put them on the defensive because they couldn't come up with any real reasons. other than the fact that you didn't weigh enough, you couldn't handle equipment, and other biological problems.
But the real question should be, why a women's team? Why not just take the best team? I mean, it took a while before there was an all-woman space mission. Why not have men and women working together? That was my original proposal, which got nixed, and I was told, not by you, but they said they expected hanky-panky on the reef. I mean, those are the words.
I mean, this was the government program, and we did not allow hanky-panky.
Exactly, except there's no hanky-panky.
In Wachalupa, we had many mixed teams.
And Hydrolab, too.
Yeah, but that was after Tektite.
That's true, absolutely.
That brings me actually to, I think, a really important question. I mean, I think that there's, without a doubt, we can think about the context of the dawn of the 70s in Tektite and the immediate connections to ecology, EPA, NOAA, this kind of thing. But I'd like to scale out even further and think about the context of the mission and the program and its broader cultural impact. I think one of the things, Sylvia and Jim, that you're both talking about is that communicating science to the public was a really important part of this. Whether it was done in a kind of spectacular way, oh, look, female aquanauts, or, oh, look, Ed, the historic first, you know, you're an aquanaut like an astronaut going down into the depths, you know, and setting a record and these kind of things. So I'm curious to hear from some of you what you think was really, really effective about Tektite, either as a program or for you personally, as it impacted your careers and as you've launched into really stewards of public education and entrepreneurship and commercial activity on behalf of science in a broader cultural context?
Well, to answer about public education, that was really not part of our thinking. Once we decided and found you folks, you ladies, we treated you pretty much the same, except we're fighting PR issues that came up one way or another. But I mean, you went through the training, you went through the safety procedures and all those things, just like all the male teams did. And at the end, you ladies put in more time on the bottom. You put in more peer-reviewed publications on the scientific programs, and it just worked out great. And I can say that because I was looking along with Jan of the people here as an administrator as well as a diving. And Jan and I later had a dive, and we were living at 100 feet and diving to 265 feet. And he had a problem with the rebreather that almost cost him his life. I had a problem with the broken hose at 250 feet. When pow, it broke. And I had to get back. I had a buddy with me, and I was using my air. We had tanks on our back for emergencies. Your incident, Sylvia, was quite similar. You know, we heard, and that was the end of the breathing, just like that. No dribbling along. And the reason I'm sitting here is that I went through my Navy friends and said, I'm going to be using a Kirby Morgan helmet. Tell me how to ditch it. So I spent an afternoon ditching that helmet in Bethesda in the tank. And that's what saved me. So basically the same. You took some training on using it and everything. Otherwise, a situation like that, you get panicky. Well, I don't mean to get into all that. But overall, if I were to do it over again, I'd do it the same way. I'm referring to your mission, the selection of you guys. And First, well, you wouldn't get along. Your women are going to be arguing fighting about the color of your tanks and stuff like this. That came up. Silly as it was.
I want to invite Ed to offer your perspective on Tektite 1 and 2, being an aquanaut in both, what your perspective is on the impact of Tektite.
Well, excuse me. Hi, all. I give a lot of talks, especially last year, which was the 50th anniversary of Tektite 1. And one of the most common questions I get is, what was the most important aspect of the Tektite program? And my answer is unequivocal. It was the women's team. Your team set the stage. I tell people Sally Ride rode on your backs. And it changed science. So we are greatly indebted to you.
Thank you for that perspective. I really, I didn't take, I took it seriously. We worked really hard, right? But the historical perspective that you get when you're older and when the times have changed, I didn't have that at the time. I'll honestly say it was like Ann says, all this publicity was a bother, right? It's like, oh my God. But anyway, so to hear now, how the importance of us getting out there and doing this. And I have a whole bag of newspapers and things like that from all over the world in every language possible. It caught the imagination. The underwater, even today, I've had friends who have gone down to the Tektite Museum in Lameshur Bay, and they come back to Wilmington, North Carolina, and says, "Oh, Alina, we saw you lived underwater." And they had something on one of the cruise ships at one time, and it captures the imagination because so many people have no idea what's underneath there. And other than watching television and the BBC and Planet Ocean and Jacques Cousteau, people are afraid of it. So, to have us go down there and bring it back, I think, and we survived, and we were young and vigorous, I think it put a different spin on all of that. And that's maybe why it has this connection. In addition to, at the time, women just didn't do that kind of stuff.
Well, for those of you who don't know, I don't remember, but within our book, the first female aquanaut was Madame Cousteau.
Yes.
And that's by accident, because she got sick and tired of hanging around up on the place, and she went down and spent about 3 or 4 days at one of the missions down there. So appropriately enough, Madame Cousteau was, to my knowledge, the first female aquanaut.
No, I think that's history. It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So she also was one of the first people using scuba diving too. I mean, they used her as a test person to test all their new things they were putting out. So she was right there at the very beginning, and she was incredibly supportive in the whole process of getting all of us underwater, whether it was male or female. She was an important woman in the process and sat in the background, but she supported him.
And she mothered several sons
Yes.
who went on to keep the tradition going too, so in addition to
That's
everything
very
else.
Yes.
What a family.
It's a mystery why the whole idea of living underwater or even with submarines to take humans into the ocean, it seems we've lost our way. That we're still doing it high in the sky. The space station really has continued to capture the hearts and minds of people with real results. There's a difference between sending a robot. We need them. We need the weather stations underwater. We need the autonomous systems. We need all that. But we also need to take ourselves. There's no substitute for the human presence. And I'm just baffled. When I was at NOAA, it was already hard, but at least at the time, there was a national underwater research program still in existence. That's gone. And the support for the Aquarius. gone. Support for submersibles, gone, except for Alvin. It's like having one Jeep to study the whole world underwater, if you will, with our support. So that's the mystery.
Tektite affected my life, and I have continued in saturation diving to this day. In fact, I'm the only one that runs a habitat other than Aquarius. And there are two purposes. We took the habitat La Chalupa and turned it into the Jules Undersea Lodge. It's never made a penny. The whole idea was to get more and more people interested in what you could see and what it was like to live underwater, to try to emphasize what Sylvia is saying, is to get more support for underwater living.
Yes.
Unfortunately, I can tell you it has not been successful.
Well,
it certainly changed my life, and my whole life has been now working with underwater habitats.
I want to just say out loud to the people watching that we are taking questions in the chat. So if anyone has any questions for the Aquanauts, this is a great time to add them. And I just want to let you guys know that we have a question about what do you think happened after Tektite with the cultural obsession with living underwater that seemed to exist prior to Tektite. There was this dream of living underwater, and it has kind of dissipated. What do you think happened to that?
It dried up in the late 70s. It just the whole ocean program in the United States and just went away. And there was no money for marine science or habitats, period.
Well, in the underwater program in NOAA, it was primarily the people up at the top were weather people. NOAA was supposed to go to the Department of Commerce, but for political reasons, NOAA went to the Department of the Interior. I mean, supposed to go to Interior, but they ended up in the Department of Commerce. And when you were there for what, 1 year, Sylvia? About?
2 years. Well, 3 years. I was there 2 years as chief scientist, and then a year staying on trying to make something of the National Marine Sanctuary Program.
Yeah. I got involved in that because we had moved down to the Keys and all that. So anyway, one of the reasons is money. The other is the background and interest of the top people in NOAA. Wouldn't you agree, Sylvia?
Yes, and the perception that satellites are expensive and any money that was there, that was a priority. Of course it's a priority, but so is exploring the ocean and knowing the ocean from not just the top down, but also from the bottom up.
Yeah.
And the truth will come out in the end, why we need to be in the ocean. Ultimately, we'll get there. But we, you know, I say sometimes that we've invested in aviation and space and it's paid off handsomely, but we've neglected the ocean and it is costing us dearly.
Yes, it is.
I think that one of the things that isn't fully appreciated is the Sputnik effect. And Tektite really was part of the whole national security program, putting men in the sea. The Navy was interested in this, and there was a lot of effort directed toward it. There was a huge amount of money for science. It was just, for those of us who were in it, it was a remarkable time. And then it just dried up. And with it, I think a lot of spirit of exploration.
And care for the ocean, understanding that the ocean, the most important thing that we expect from the ocean is our existence. But we look at the ocean as a place to take things. It's the value of the ocean in the minds of many is what can you take out of the ocean, whether it's fish or oil or gas or minerals. But all that aside, if people get it, if they understand that the ocean keeps us alive, that if we don't take care of the ocean, nothing else matters, really. But we're, you know, you hear people say, well, we can just go to someplace. Once we finish with Earth, we can go somewhere else. You know, let's go find another place to set up civilization. Well, yeah, right. Got to take care of this place. And it starts with caring for the ocean.
So I think a lot of it comes down to money, obviously, and also what people perceive are the problems in the world. I mean, I am glad for all those satellites up there with climate change. I mean, if we didn't have those satellites trying to figure out what's going on, we'd be in deep doo-doo. But I think we also have a societal problem about, as an academic, university professor all my life, the decrease in science education.
Yes.
We have a lot of under-information, to put it mildly, in our public. And that's a tragedy. The way science is taught in the schools these days is pretty minimal and sometimes incorrect. So, and I think, you know, people vote for things and legislators go by, you know, they're just people like us who get elected and go on to make decisions in Washington where the money goes. And if they're not educated about the value of the oceans, other than feeding people through fishes, right? You know, fishing and underwater mining, the consumption side of things
is a big problem.
Yeah, and you know, science is all about curiosity about how things work. You know, how do they do that? How does that happen? Why is it that way? And those are the kind of questions that we are trained and, you know, spend our life researching, trying to figure things out. But if that curiosity doesn't go deeper than what you see on, and I love all of the BBC programs, everything else, they're wonderful, but they're gee whiz and they're superficial, right? And so that's the level of appreciation of science that we have in our people these days.
So I'd like to add something to that, if you don't mind. When I was running around Washington trying to promote undersea activity, and I did a lot of that, as Jim knows. I kept going with senators and with congressmen and with governors, and by golly, as soon as you'd sort of get them interested, they'd lose the election or they'd be assassinated and they'd disappear. So I decided about 35 years ago that we really need to get the young people involved. They need, when you walked up to a lawyer or a banker and you said, I'd like you to invest in the ocean, he'd go, boy, do I remember this when I was a kid, and yes, I'll do it. And that actually happened to me with the governor of the Virgin Islands. So I started a marine environmental education program in the Florida Keys. And up until coronavirus, we were bringing in 4,000 to 5,000 students a year for a 2 to 5 day environmental education program. And over 35 years, I've seen how that's paid off, because I have fathers coming in with their kids, and these fathers were students, and they're bringing their children back to say, this is where I became a science teacher or an engineer in the ocean. And so it just gives me goosebumps every time I hear them say that, and it's working. But we need more and more of that.
I'm going to step in, and we have another question from the audience, and we're starting to eye up the close of the panel, so I'll put this forward as a last big question, and then I'm just going to wind all of you up and let you go, right? So, you know, again, to really linger on what's been so important about all of this, you know, this is a celebration, right? This is a really momentous moment. Last year marked the 50th anniversary of Tektite I. This month, these very days are the 50th anniversary of the historic female mission. And so it really offers us a moment to pause and kind of reflect on the sort of long arc of this. We've talked about the context of, you know, where ocean research has gone in the last 50 years. But while I have you all on screen, and I have to say, I feel a little bit like a University of Texas psychological observer in that I have like a grid of everyone's face. It's like I'm looking at all the corners of the habitat all at once. I'm curious, and to lead off of a question from the audience, you know, Tektite wasn't the first, right? There were other missions before. It wasn't the deepest, but it had such historical significance, and everyone to a person who was involved, right? Everyone who passed through St. John and through Lameshur has these absolutely indelible memories of the experience. It formed an incredible sense of camaraderie and stewardship. Everyone was sort of absolutely galvanized by their experiences with the program. So what was some of the most unexpected aspects of either being in this program or living underwater or experiencing the habitat that you carry with you now, some 50 years later?
Well, there's some screwy situations because the image of Tektite in the islands was a match without a war. That's a good description. But we had volunteers just drop in. On one occasion, a priest from Fordham University was on vacation there, and he heard of the program, so he came over and talked. He said, "Boy, I'd like to join you guys and do something." So, we looked at him and said, a Fordham priest? And I said, "What can you do?" And he said, "I can repair cars." He was part of our program because we knew we had a lot of Jeeps that needed constant repair. And our chief chef was a hippie that showed up. Was a good cook and reliable. Remember Jan, all these guys? Or maybe you don't. Or Jan, are you awake? I guess not.
He's laughing.
Anyway, and there were some 500 people involved with Tektite, all of whom, except the very few, were volunteers. And that's how that program kept going. I think that kind of approach would work right today because there are people that would give their eye teeth to get into a program with excitement like that.
But the base camp, Jim, was a MASH operation, fun MASH operation. In fact, the commander of the camp was Commander Looney, literally Commander Looney, and the head of the Seabees was Commander Eager, and the lady that came in every week to take our blood was Dr. Carolyn Leach. So these are real names of real people, and the place was a riot from a operational standpoint.
I loved it.
Well, you forgot about the deposition who had lost one eye in the past, and he kept taking his bad eye out and he'd go to the car and take it out and stick it in his ear or whatever. So we had some interesting people on the program.
You cannot make this stuff up.
No, I'm really not. But it's not a once upon a time thing,
I still remember learning to draw blood and my first attempt at it when Rick Waller said, "If your hand can't stop shaking, I'll do it myself."
So what, he kept shaking your hand?
And swallowing the balloons, Ed, remember that?
Oh gosh.
You had to run a balloon down your nose to your stomach to to test your esophageal pressure.
By the end of the dive, we could do it, but it's never anything I'd want to do recreationally.
The question was asked, where this all led us, and what was the lasting thing that stayed with you? And Tektite changed my life because it led you on to do it taught me to do what I wanted to do whenever an opportunity arrived. And now I've gotten distracted a bit. It's too early in the morning here. But if I hadn't been on Tektite, I never would have met my husband because we met via a NASA project where he was running a design competition for NASA with the American AIA and NASA Ames. And they needed people to judge the designs from the architectural students. And that's how we met. And we've gone on together all these years to lead a very different life that involved, other than the ocean, but we worked in a lot of environmental causes. And we are very lucky to have had the life we have, and that's the important thing. And I think Tektite, whether we stayed in the underwater or whatever, I think Tektite led to bringing all of us further beyond where we would have been if we hadn't had it. And we've made it possible for other people to go on and do that. And it's each personal journey that's the very important thing.
I agree.
I think for me, it really changed the kind of science career that I had. I mean, I was a good diver, you know, Scripps trained us really well, but I was really more of a lab rat. I mean, I did a lot of chemical analyses and things like that, my electron microscopy, and spending all those hours and hours and hours every day and watching, you know, becoming part of the ecosystem sort of sparked all these questions and ideas about things that, wonder how they do that. And so, you know, all the work that I went on to do with coral spawning and coral physiology and trying to do everything underwater, you know, trying to take the science to the water instead of the lab, the other way around, the ocean back to the lab. That was sort of what I got out of Tektite.
Using the ocean as a laboratory, really,
yeah,
that makes all the difference. I mean, terrestrial scientists take for granted. I mean, look at Jane Goodall, for heaven's sakes. She spent 15 years in one place, basically, getting to know animals who live there very well, one species, and the system that makes the chimpanzees who and what they are. Living underwater really triggered that. I kind of intellectually knew it, always so frustrated that these stopwatch diving, you have 20 minutes at 100, might stretch an hour if you go to 60 feet. But to have it is the gift of time to be able to really get to know how one thing relates to another and to see the magnitude of what we do not know and what we cannot know unless we actually are there for the long pull. I've been back to the Tektite location and things that the investment that was made over that is 2 years of intensive studies from many different brains looking at the same area, I think was in itself an experience, a gift, getting to know that little patch of the Virgin Islands. Somebody studied the lobsters, somebody else studied this kind of fish, somebody else did that. I studied the plants as well as looking at how, anyway, as a point of reference, as a baseline, there just aren't many places like that. Now the Aquarius similarly has a place that is known pretty well because a lot of people have been looking intensively over a period of time. And I need so much more of this to really get to know the ocean. And still, we're looking at this sunlit portion, and most of the ocean is deep and dark and cold and mostly unexplored. What are we waiting for? Why can't we motivate our species to get out there, get down there, and to stay there for the long pull, to get to know Earth? It's right here. I mean, sure, we have to go to Mars. Oh, absolutely. But what about this part of the solar system? What about this part of the universe? It really drives me crazy that we have such complacency about our own blue backyard. What is it that keeps us from really eagerly with money? Money should not be the problem. It should not. It should be a priority. Getting to know Earth, well, ocean.
I agree with you. In particular, one thing you said, Sylvia, that when you're living down there, you don't just know, well, there's that fish again. You know that fish is named Sam because you see Sam every day swimming through the entrance to the habitat about the same time of day. So if to study the ocean from the surface is like studying the forest you know, from an airplane flying over it.
Right.
And that happens to be a trite comparison, but it's true. And you can see so much when Jan lowered the habitat that we were in 10 miles offshore to the bottom. Very quickly after that habitat was there on the bottom, coming down from the surface, fish were picking out the corners of it and marking it as their territory, however they mark it.
Yes.
I mean, because people said, oh, habitats will scare people away. I'm sorry, scare fish away. Well, it's quite the opposite, as we all know.
It was a magnet.
Unfortunately, I have to be the timekeeper, and I just want to ask Anne if you have any last comments to share with us.
Yeah, I'd just like to answer the question too, what was the most important aspect of Tektite for me? And part of it was watching the ocean, as Sylvia has said, and learning it up close and having time to do that. I think for me, the most important thing was to learn the importance of communicating with the public, or wanting to, or having to. And also, I learned the importance of a lot of the government agencies, which is something I didn't know before, and one of the reasons I went to law school.
I find it unbelievable that we've already gone just over 90 minutes, because I could spend the next 2 days hearing all of you speak to one another, and it's truly an honor and a pleasure to hear all of you reflect on both the ways that the program has impacted your individual lives and your careers, and the way that the program has shaped a whole cultural and environmental consciousness over the past half century. I acknowledge others who chimed in with comments and questions throughout the panel. And I just really want to personally thank all of you, Ed, Jan, Jim, Sylvia, Anne, Peggy, and Alina, not only for your remarkable service and your pioneering spirit and all of your contributions, but for being such remarkable citizens. You know, a phrase that's come up so many times is the idea of being a citizen of the reef. And I think you all have been such inspiring figures to all sorts of fields that you've touched over the last decades. And so it's a real pleasure and honor to have the privilege of getting to speak with you in this context. So I'm going to turn things over to Meghan for sort of parliamentary ending of the panel. But I just very much wanted to thank all of you and celebrate this historic moment. So thank you all very much.
I think we couldn't have had a better start to this 2-day celebration. It's been wonderful to hear all of your comments, and thank you so much. I want to say to everyone watching that there's a lot more to come, so stay tuned. We're going to go into a break now, but we'll return in about 20 minutes for the next panel. Please check the schedule, because some of the panelists that are here today are presenting later on. And you can hear more from them throughout the next 2 days. So thank you again to all the Aquanauts. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us.
How great to see you all after all these years.
It's so good to see you.
Thank you, Jan, for all your help with my spawning work.